this time, because what I'm going to do is to sort of do a crossover between PowerShell, PowerCLI, and Windows Presentation Framework, so WPF. So the end result of that, and yes, I am using PowerShell ISE, and no, I don't feel embarrassed about it. I'm just used to it. I know that it's always going to be there on machines because I used to do a lot of coding on customer systems. I have got code open, as you'll see. Look, I do have it open. I'm doing some Azure stuff in there at the moment, but I tend to use ISE. The script I'm going to show you, which is on my GitHub repository, which is Guy R. Leach, it will actually run in PowerShell 7 as well as PowerShell 6, and I had to do very little to it to make it run in PowerShell 7. But I tend to run it in 6, but it doesn't really matter what I run it in. So if I actually just start the script, hopefully it's going to work for me today. So that's going to be communicating with some saved servers. So this persists a lot of settings into the registry as well, so you don't have to bother with all those tedious command line parameters, even though we can tab complete them. So what I'm going to do is really sort of flip between the script. I'm not going to go through all, how many lines have we got now? Or 4,000 lines. This is one of those scripts that's just come together over time. If you look at the modification history, because I use it a lot, it's a script I use every day. Just to position the script, again, because we're part VMware, part PowerShell. So those of you who are VMware people, probably used to the vSphere web interface. So I can look at virtual machines, I can do things, I can manage snapshots, I can create machines, I can look at data stores, yada, yada, yada. But for somebody who just wants to use VMs, boot them, etc., it can be a little bit confusing, or as we say in English, daunting. Where do I go for this? What do I do? So what I decided to do was to write a user interface. Let me just minimize that for the moment. So I'll bring that up. That somebody could use quite simply to manage their virtual machines. Again, this is just managing all of those I've got powered on. So by default, it will just show powered on virtual machines. But again, I can change that if I want. So a filter here, if I want to look at specific machines, so I want to look at my master VMs for Horizon or Citrix, whether they be powered off or suspended. Of course, accelerators, Alt-S, that sort of stuff. I can do all that. So there are various ways of filtering quite easily. Sorting on all these columns, so I can pick machines, I can power them up. So notice I've got context menu here, some buttons at the bottom. Now I will say, because you look at it and go, that's a horrible UI guy. And yes, I would agree with you. I'm not a UI person. I started my coding career back in the 1980s when I guess, quite a few of you probably weren't even born. And I was using a green screen over serial line to a Unix box writing device drivers, which is kind of why I'm at home with simple GUIs, if not command lines. So if we go back to the main page with all my powered on VMs, again, it doesn't really matter what they are. Simple UI, but again, designed to be simple. I don't need 3D, I don't need coloring, just simple buttons. Things like scroll bars come for free. So how did I start writing this user interface? Well, I use Visual Studio, good old Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code, but Visual Studio, which you can get in a community edition, for non-corporate use. So you just start a WPF project, so file, new project. Thinks about it. This machine is running very slowly, even though I've got a PowerShell script running that's paused all the threads in all my communication programs. So all the things in the taskbar at the bottom here mostly aren't running because I've had all their threads paused. Again, a script on my GitHub repo, Microsoft one that you'll see. Hopefully we'll be able to filter on WPF. So you would go in, and again, it doesn't really matter what language you pick, usually C#. because I'm not actually writing any code in Visual Studio. I'm purely using it as a GUI designer. So I'd create a new WPF application, uses .NET framework underneath, and this is the main screen. So if we go back to the GUI itself, you kind of probably half recognize it. Well, I haven't drawn the grid in there because the grid is automatically created when the script runs. So obviously it's dynamically created from what it retrieves from vCenter or ESXi. So if you don't have vCenter, you can use this in a corporate environment, or you could use it in a home lab. I'm lucky enough to get vCenter, but if you only had ESXi, it will also talk to ESXi. Some of the features won't be available, but most of them are. So that's how the GUI starts life, because what we can do is just, let me just move my toolbar out of the way. What we can do is then put up the design and then start to drag and drop GUI components. So if I do a new let's do add a new form, if I can remember how to do that. It's not often I use Visual Studio, so this is why I'm a little bit rusty with it. I used to be a C++ developer, but that was back in the days of green screens. As you can see, what we've got here is, in the upper portion is our window. So this is what you see is what you get, what we used to call WYSIWYG side of things. So I can design my UI. And in the bottom, we have the XAML, XAML, which will represent what that GUI is like in code. So you can see if I pick a button here, filter, for instance, we'll see that picks this button with content filter, tells me where it is, and all this sort of alignment stuff. But most of this stuff I haven't typed in. I've literally just gone, if I copy that, if I want another button in here, let's paste that. Oops, let's put it somewhere else, bang it in here. Then you can see it's already given it a name, it's given me the content, and I can then just modify that as I need to do it. And when I've got that code ready, I can literally just select it all with Control A, put it into the clipboard, go to my PowerShell script, and actually find it. And what we'll see in my PowerShell script is a lot of, let's get that out of the way. So I'm reading also reduced resolution to hopefully give people a better chance of reading. Can people read this, by the way, on the, or do I need to increase the font size?
It seems good, Guy.
Yeah, it's good. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just get the chat up as well so I can see some of the questions. Yeah, okay. If there's anything really important, I'll just shout up. So what we'll see in the code when we get past all the comments and my nice large parameter block is lots of here strings. So for instance, the main window is in a here string here, literally copied and pasted from Visual Studio, that bottom pane, straight into here. And that gives me the code in here. That's the raw content. So what I've then got to do is to put this into a window, which again, I can't lay claim to this. I found a function on the internet somewhere, and it's so long ago, it's before I even started putting comments in, because normally when I borrow other people's code, I will always put a reference into it. When I get an idea or a chunk of code, I will always put a reference into that person's code. I'm never claiming it for myself. For some reason, I lost the reference for where this function originally came from. Yeah, this is where code would be a bit more useful to go to the definition of that function. Just talk amongst yourselves when I find the form. That's what I like about these things when I make them up as I go along. You can see that it's real life. There we go. So there's the new form function. Again, we don't really need to know how it works. Again, this is code I borrowed. I ought to find the original somewhere and give credit to it, because it's a bit rude of me not to. But this basically creates the form using Windows Presentation Framework, and we'll set a whole load of variables, because what we have to do once we've got our raw framework. So for instance, what I did this week, I added a feature to my snapshot function. So if we look at the actual script running, you'll see that I've got a I've got a snapshot function here. So we've got embedded context menus. So I can say take snapshot. And being the old-fashioned kind of guy I am, I always like to shut down a machine before I take a snapshot that I'm going to revert to, rather than taking a live one. Also, it takes less memory because you're not snapshotting the memory. So I thought, well, rather than me having to shut down from here, power shut down, then go in and do the snapshot and then start it again, why not just be lazy and add it to my user interface? So I added this new checkbox this week simply by going to the correct item. This is where it came from. I just took one of these, copied it, pasted it. Let's just move it out of the way. Let's just try and move it out of the way. Yeah, well done, guy. I'm good with this stuff. You can tell, can't you? Oh, that's because it's put it in a sub item. But what I could do then is just change all the change a bit of. Shall I start speaking English? I could change all the items in here. The key is to give it a name, because that will become a part of the name of the variable that references it in my code that hooks into this, because this literally just gives me something that I can display, and then I've got to, if you like, wire it up. So I have to say what happens when somebody clicks OK on here. So let's ignore that for the moment. Get that out of the way. So what we'll see is, sorry, I'll go back to that dialog box again. So I'd type some information in, test, description, whatever, something meaningful. So it means something to me when I come back to it, that, and then click OK on the snapshot. And then what we'll actually see is, if it's working properly, I can bring this window back over here and click OK. So it's wanting to say, do I want to confirm? So again, I add confirm dialog boxes. These are very easy to produce in there. And say, yeah, of course I want to do that. And then we can see in my vCenter, it's doing a shutdown. Of course, it's going to wait for the shutdown to finish before it actually starts doing the snapshot. So we can see the shutdown is finished. It started doing the snapshot. And then it powers it on. Obviously, the snapshot's only a momentary thing because it's just creating another Delta disk. So how does all that fit together? Well, let's actually drop some breakpoints in. So for instance, need to find that code, and it's the 4,000 plus lines. Let's set a breakpoint here. Let's run it again. It is quite slow today. I don't know why that is. It's something to do with the authentication. I think it's having to, because it's running from my laptop here, which is not actually domain joined, although it's a bit faster than it was when I started at the beginning of this presentation. So let's just move this off to the side. In fact, I'm going to delete that snapshot before I carry on, because I don't have a huge amount of space. So again, just another WPF dialog box. So let's go through that snapshot process again. So you can see now we've stopped at the breakpoint within the code, because what happened was, if we look for that string, find what happened is when I was, if you like, connecting up the user interface. So you remember the button was called BTN, because again, we just try and use a good naming convention. So BTN for a button, for instance. So we go back to the WPF code, then you'll see the buttons here are BTN. So what's happened in that new form function that I showed you briefly is basically all of these items, their names get turned into PowerShell variables with a prefix of WPF. Again, the prefix is just set in that new form function. Again, let's say this whole script is available on my GitHub repo anyway, if you want to have a play and understand how it works. So what I need to do is to call one of the methods on the buttons to actually wire it up to do something when that button is clicked. And what I'm doing here is simply calling a function within my code, which passes it an object, the operation that it wants to do. So you can see this is how we support different operations, and then the details of the virtual machine itself. So that's how we sort of plumb together, if you like, the user interface. So a lot of the user interface code, the slow bit, if you like, is once you've created it. If we look right at the end of the script, which is where a lot of the building is put together, we're adding a lot of these button actions. What happens when the button is clicked? So that tends to be the tedious, the boring, the slow bit of putting a user interface together, which we have to do in the PowerShell development environment rather than the Visual Studio environment. Because if we were doing it there, by default, we want to do it in C# rather than PowerShell. But it's pretty easy to do in here. So if we go back to where the breakpoint was, so you can see we're in this function there. I set the breakpoint. Oh, forget that. I love live demos. I completely forget what I was doing. So I can set the state of buttons, for instance. So if the VM itself was powered off, then I wouldn't offer the ability to quiesce the file system, which you need VMware tools installed for, or snapshot the memory because it's not running. So again, we turn those buttons off. You don't need to, it's just a nice convenient feature. We then show the dialog itself. So this is how we take the dialog that we've built from that new form function and actually show it. So that pops it up, and .NET shows that for us. And if that returns true, so the dialog result is true, which is what happens when the OK button is clicked, this big code here, then as long as we can get the virtual machine, notice I tend to do this, which is considered poor practice, but it's just what I do, which is assigning and testing within the same statement. So I'm assigning to VM and also checking that it's not null, all within the same statement. It's just one line of code rather than two. I'm building up a parameter block for or a hash table via splatting for the snapshot function. Then there's some logic around so the is checked checks whether a button is checked or not. So if that shutdown take snapshot and start button is checked, so it's ticked. This is where the message box comes from. If you remember, when I ran it, you saw, am I sure I want to do this operation? So I just don't want to go ahead if someone's picked the wrong VM and are about to shut down an Exchange server or domain control or whatever else. It's like, no, let's get some confirmations in there. So we again use built-in classes to show a message box. And if the answer's yes, then what we'll do is we'll go in and actually shut down the guest. So again, we're starting to use, actually you've now seen a PowerCLI call. Yeah, so we're going to shut down the guest. Now the problem with shutting down the guest, unless Luke knows a better way, it doesn't give us status. So it's not like other operations where we can check the task. It just, it's a set and forget. So I had to go around in a loop polling, which I don't like. It's inefficient, and I don't usually hard code values either, but I do actually have the maximum wait time, because you notice in here I'm doing that loop while the VM is not powered off, and just in case it gets stuck, the date is less than the end wait time, which is the time it starts plus number of seconds that it waits for, which is one of many parameters. But again, what I tend to do is, rather than hard code things, if you forget that bit there, is to put these things in as parameters with default values. So this defaults, I think, to 120 seconds. So this will wait for at most 2 minutes before it comes out here. And if it's not powered off, it'll say timed out waiting. Actually then sets the answer to abort, so that if the answer is not yes down here, it won't then do the snapshot. So this is where we do the snapshot with the splatted parameters, as in the hash table that is the parameters. So things like what the VM is and whether we run it async, although I change it to running synchronously if I'm doing the shutdown and start. Once we've done the snapshot, I then start it. So again, a few PowerCLI calls in there, but this is hopefully you're starting to get a feel for how this stuff fits together. The context menus is perhaps the other interesting thing, interesting in a technical sense anyway, probably not the sort of thing you want to talk to somebody about at a party. So I just minimize that a little bit. I'll tell you what, let me continue the script. Because the script's paused, the context menu is staying up on the screen. So if I continue the script, then that will then go away. So if we look at the main window, and you'll see what we have in here. Again, let's just make that a little bit smaller. Is you'll see I've got a context menu. Again, this is manually coded within the XAML, the XAML. So really, it's just a menu item. What it is, as you can see, I've got things like MSTSC, reconfigure. I'll read them all out to you, and then the name of the item. So if we pick one of these, so let's have a look at the MSTSC, for instance, because again, this is one of the main features of this that I use a lot. So let's cancel that. So so you see if I right click, then I've got MSTSC. But what I've also added is double click action. Double click action is actually configurable to what you want. So if MSTSC is what you mostly use, the default is MSTSC. But you could also pass on the command line double click action to be console. So if I just pick one of these, it doesn't really matter which one it is. I just double click that, and it's actually going to start an MSTSC to that machine. So again, this is why I don't tend to use one of those RDP manager type programs where you have to statically add all your connections, because this just dynamically will connect to any of these. Again, you don't need to worry about the DNS because it's finding the IP addresses. It knows what to connect to. So this is, if you like, a dynamic RDP manager. But if we go and see how that, or I've got a custom option. So when I put it onto one of my larger monitors, I can put something in like, so I've got a WQHD resolution monitor. I can put in a different resolution rather than the default. Again, you can change the default, of course, everything. I try and avoid hard coding. Hard coding is the devil's work, as I tell people. But forget you saw that hard coded 5 seconds in my script. So if we go back to the code to look at how we wire up these context menus. So let's have a look for MSTSC context menu, for instance. So there we see it in a XAML that's been copied from the Visual Studio. And for the multiple windows, we just have multiple Hairstrings. So I've got quite a lot of different dialog boxes. So each one's just a separate Hairstring. So I can update those as and when I need to. Sometimes I just might, if something's not quite right, I might make a change in here. A lot of people saying, well, for XAML, they will actually just do it by hand anyway. I think it's a bit like Matrix code, Matrix the film, where you don't really need a GUI designer. Those people who do this all day, every day. I don't do GUIs all day, every day, as you can tell from the quality of them. I have to go back to something like Visual Studio, but a lot of people can just hand write these, like in some way I can hand write PowerShell without RTFMing. So if we now look for that, so you see what it's done is created another one of these WPF variables when it's processed that XAML, created a variable, And then again, I can just do an add click. So this is basically saying when that context menu item for the MSTSC is clicked, then again, call my function, process action. So as you can see, this process action function has quite a lot of different abilities. So it's quite a long function, but better function than putting a whole code. I mean, you can put a whole code block in here. I mean, this is a code block. It just happens to be calling a function. Yeah. So this is how I wire up that context menu. Again, a little bit tedious, but of course, once you've done one, you just copy and paste and remember to change things, and you're on your way. So what else are we doing in here then? Let's have a look at some of the other things that we can do, and then maybe look at the PowerCLI side of things. So I think I was asked to present this because it's a nice sort of crossover between the two groups. Obviously, you have the PowerShell underneath, the Windows presentation framework, and just PowerShell, but also because a lot of it uses PowerCLI as well. So I can do a number of different things from here. We've seen the snapshot stuff. One I spent quite a bit of time doing was the ability to run stuff. So again, I put a tweet out today because I came to use this for something, just to see the installed programs, because we're told that MSTSC 2 machines is bad from a security perspective. There's MSTSC or RDP is weak. So I built in this ability to be able to run things. It can run scripts, but it can also run things like GP update, which we obviously frequently do in the Windows world of things without /force, but let's not go there. So I can run scripts, I can run executables, and this is all persisted. So that's another nice thing with this script. So that this ties in with that registry thing that you may have heard of. I go there every now and again. So here, for instance, it will write to current user. So multiple people on the same machine can have different settings. But again, because they've got the registry PowerShell provider, it's very easy to do registry things. So you can see this is where that list of commands comes from. There's my list of persisted commands. So when the program exits, it just writes this collection that it's built up or read initially from the registry back out to the registry. So we can persist it nicely, plus the arguments as well, if needed to. So you can see I've done things like firewall changes and restarting of services, all that sort of thing from one place. And one of the beauties of this thing is that I can actually multiply select machines and perform operations, because when again we process whatever the context menu callback is, we can say what are the selected items in this grid view and process each item. So if I wanted to, let's say I'm going to shut them all down, which I'm not going to. So what we can then do is put a tri-state dialog up. So we can say, well, what do I want to? I probably don't want to get prompted for all 9 of these. What if there were 90 of them? So do I say yes for all? No, just to do one machine, so I can do one machine at a time. Or what I'm going to do now, because I don't really want to shut those down, is cancel. And nothing happens at all. Again, that's just all code with a message box, as we saw earlier, looking at the result and deciding what to do. That's all. It's all pretty straightforward. But elsewhere in the script, so you see we've got things like the parameters, and this is why I've not had to give it a server name, because it automatically remembers it, and that can actually be a list. So when I brought up that second ESXi box in my private cloud data center garage, which is my backdrop for the Zoom call, I could just literally specify a second server on the command line. So I didn't persist it because there's a minus save settings which I didn't specify, because that machine's powered off at the moment, which would slow things down. So I can just say minus server. And then, in fact, let me bring up my terminal. Notice there's no command prompts in here. Oh, look, I've killed Spotify. I don't use Spotify anymore. I object. So, in fact, if we go back over here, that means there's one of these running already somewhere. There we go. as well as the one running through ISE. I'll quit that. This is where I tend to run it from. You can see this is where I'm setting, passing some of the parameters. So this time I'm actually passing the parameter for the server name through. As we can see, hopefully you know about control space. You can tab through parameters in PowerShell, but control space will actually give you a list, so you can move your cursor keys around them. And if you notice bottom left, it actually shows you the type as well. So these are all the parameters we could use. So these are the default ones that I tend to use, specifying a specific screenshot folder, because again, one of the features is to go and get a screenshot from a VM. By default, it just throws it away, but if you specify a folder, it will keep it. And it also actually will because I'm non-domain joined here, I get it to force a name for the MSTSC connections when I make them as well. So nice rich set of command line options as well. When I say I try and make everything parameterizable, if that's a word. I'm sure it would be in German, wouldn't it? Because you just string everything together to make those words. So there's my parameter block. It's actually quite short, given some of my more recent parameter blocks of scripts, because anything that could be changed, I make it a parameter with a default value. Here, for instance, we can see the double click. So I said about the double click behavior of the cells in that grid view. The default is double click, but we can actually do different things. And here I'm using a validate set to make sure whatever the string people put in is a valid one. So I don't let them enter something thinking that's going to work, and when later on they double click, it goes error, I don't know what this is. So again, validating user input as much as possible. And of course we can change RDP ports, because that's recognized as a good security practice. This script will also save and restore credentials. So again, like I said, I'm actually doing this from a non-domain joined laptop, but it's logging on to my domain joined vCenter, or domain integrated vCenter, with a credential that it's saved in my profile, again using secure strings, so relatively secure, relatively. So if we go back to the script, I think I was at a breakpoint, wasn't I? In fact, was I at a breakpoint? Yes, I was. Where was I in the breakpoint? No, I wasn't. Okay, so we go back to here. What else of note? I mean, let me just have a look if there's any question. I mean, feel free to bang in any questions that you want about how particular things work. Some of the more interesting or more difficult bits to implement were the CD mounting. So I can mount a data store ISO. So I've got a data store browser in here. Now you can get PS drives if you're familiar with those. So let's just break all, which, because it's in the middle of some WPF code, oh no, it will break. We've got a PS drive. In fact, let's get rid of that. PS drive. So you can see we've got VMware drives given by PowerCLI even. But if I look at one of those, let's have a look at VM store, for instance. No, it's not store. Some cream on it if it was. Again, I can tab complete. Wakefield, which is the city in the UK where I live. My Synology NAS, which I've got mounted via NTFS. Notice how slow it is. So for the data store browser, I looked at using the PowerShell drive provider for VMware, but it was too slow. So what I ended up doing is another interface. You can use a web interface into the data stores. So I use that, which is quite a lot of coding, to be honest, but it got there in the end. So we can then navigate those data stores to be able to mount ISOs. Again, just double clicking down, we can sort on things. That was quite troublesome. But again, doing web calls from within PowerShell with invoke web request in this case, because it wasn't a REST API as such, it's quite simple and easy to parse or disassemble, if you like, the HTML that comes back. We've got the screenshot functionality that I mentioned before. So I can't even remember how I did that. Notice it resizes, although the buttons don't. You see, my WPF is not perfect, but that's good enough. I really need to go back and fix that. But I can actually copy it to the clipboard and then paste it into things and so on. So it's a bit crude, but it works. And that will have saved it into that screenshot folder that I nominated anyway. And we get a nice rich set of information on here. If we actually click on performance stage and do a refresh, that takes a bit longer, but what we'll see is we'll get extra information about disk usage, CPU usage, so I can actually look for machines that are using too much resource, for instance, or perhaps are stuck for some reason. So that takes a bit more time to gather all that information from the vCenter. We can see we've got VMware tools, which again I can update from here. I can disconnect NICs from here. I can even reconfigure things. So what I tend to do is to put in, for instance, what version of something is. So Citrix has now released provisioning services 2203. So when I update that in my lab at some point in the next week or so, probably I can reconfigure. Now I can just change the notes in here. I can do simple things. So again, this is about me cutting it down. Yeah, you could give them, as in the tester or the QA person, the full vCenter, and then they could go in and find a VM, and you could say, oh well, yeah, just go and edit its settings. But then it all gets a bit, what do I need to do? Where I need to go? Yeah, okay. So I've simplified that, just to make it nice and easy. But what if I specify 300 gig of memory? Well, again, I've actually implemented group policy settings for this as well. Yeah, don't ask me why, it seemed a good idea at the time. So yeah, it's a whole load of code in here for, so if you're looking for something for, how do I do that with PowerCLI? Well, if it's in this user interface, there's snapshots, there's connecting and disconnecting NICs, so I can simulate a machine becoming available, unavailable, and checking my disaster recovery, business continuity, that sort of side of things. I can move machines to other data stores, obviously lots of power actions. I can then look at some of the higher level things, so my various different data stores. So this is a hyperconverged Dell rack mount server, which has got 2 sets of SSDs in there, but also a single SSD hanging on in there, which has had some errors on it, and an NFS3 and an NFS4 data store. The NFS are spinning disks, everything else is SSD, so that this is really for ISOs and installation media, backups, that sort of side of things. So again, that's just using PowerCLI to get that data. So if we go and look at how we do that sort of side of things, let's have a look at get-vm, get-data store, in fact. See how it pulls that up. So a lot of this stuff I can't actually remember how I did it, because you see I've started this script about 2.5 years ago. I'll say I still use it every day, but some of the stuff that I wrote back then I can't remember how I did it. But you know what it's like, you go back to code and think, well, how does that work? Who wrote this? Oh, I wrote this. Or perhaps that's just me because I'm very old, but that happens to me a lot, which is why I try and make code as self-documenting as possible. So meaningful variable names, always using named parameters to forms, comments where necessary. So you can see, for instance, this is a refresh form for the show data. There we go. So show data store window. So again, a different form from the Visual Studio data stores. There we go. So yeah, fairly simple window, and there's the XAML again. So that's just copied over, pasted into a Hairstring variable. Then we use the PowerCLI get data store, iterate through all of them, and then add those items to the data store list, which is what we have in here. So that's the data store list. So that's going to become WPF data store list, as we see there from that new dash form function. So this is how we populate the list. Then we make sure they're read-only, because we can't change data stores from here. Make it sortable, and then we just show the dialog. So very easy to populate a dialog with any arbitrary information from anywhere you want. And you can see here we're building the columns for that display. Again, I don't profess to be a WPF guru. I kind of learnt it from scratch. I did some WinForms programming maybe 20 years ago. So WPF was a whole new thing to me, but it's a pretty good way of being able to put together a UI with PowerShell pretty quickly. Certainly, I would say a bit easier than using Windows Forms programmatically, because we can take this XAML, which is already giving us the look and feel, and then a minimal amount of code to wire it all up. Well, I say minimal, but once you get the idea of it, or you've got a good script to copy from, so you want to put your own GUI together for something, get hold of a good example or this script, and then you can just understand how it works, putting it all together. So you see we've got the ability to put a host window, which is more of the same, get the hosts, so PowerCLI call, iterate over them, and then add these custom objects to the host list, which again is yet another control within another XAML Hairstring. The host.xaml, which again comes from the no, that's not Visual Studio, that's OneNote. I was close though. So again, hosts, it's just more the same, slightly different grid view, a few more columns, but pretty straightforward. So once you've kind of got one form working, it's pretty easy to get another one working, You're just using copy and paste. And there are tools out there which meant to simplify this and make it easier. I think Sapien do some GUI tools, but obviously they cost money, which is if you've got money or a company to pay for them, that's great. But with Visual Studio Community Edition and PowerShell ASE or VS Code, of course, then you've got your own environment for doing that. What I tend to find is if I've not written a GUI project for a while, then I'm a bit slow to start. But then, after a while, I get quicker and quicker as I remember how to do it. Oh, here's something of note. Because you might have things like the HyperV PowerShell commandlets loaded as well, which also has a get snapshot. In some places, I actually module qualify my calls so that I know exactly what I'm calling, and I'm not going to call suddenly a HyperV commandlet in the middle of a VMware script, and nothing nasty is going to happen. It'll just get confused. So that's all this, in the 4,000 lines of code. I try not to copy and paste huge chunks. That's where we come in with functions. There's some async stuff in here as well. So for instance, if I go back to the user interface, if I can find it, I have a new facility down here which uses vSphere templates. So this won't work with ESXi, but what this will allow me to do is to create a new VM from a vSphere template. So again, I'm just populating a drop-down list from the templates returned via PowerCLI. But when I click OK on that, it will actually start an asynchronous job. So what I've got in here, because in the main loop of your user interface, when we find the show dialog, you'll find the code is at that point for the entirety of the script. So if you need to do something else, so you need to service a timer, for instance, to check if that job is finished, then you need to have some sort of timer in there, which is what I've got in here. Again, as you can see, here you go. This is where I borrowed that code from. So I have something in here which goes in, and then again, I've not hard coded it, so that's in the parameter block. I forget what that is by default. 5 or 10 seconds probably. then, oh, look, my countdown timer has expired and told me my 45 minutes is up, or they did say I have an hour, so we'll see. But I'm pretty much done, I think, unless there are specific questions. But yeah, so this adds a timer. So what will happen is when the timer expires, it will go and execute the code in timer block. If we go and look what the timer block is, it's a script block. And it will just go and see, have I got that's a collection. So have there been any asynchronous tasks started? If there have, work, and notice how, because I'm working back through them, why am I working back through them? So that if I need to remove one because it's finished, I can remove it without affecting the iteration over the list. Because if you start at 0 and work forward, yeah, it's not a great idea to change the array that you're working on. Because element 0, if you delete it, you then get a new element 0, but you might miss it. Yeah, and it all gets a bit complicated or error prone. So this is where we can then, this is going to execute anyway in a separate thread. So the show dialog is the main thread of the program, but this effectively runs another thread where we can do whatever housekeeping we want. And in fact, this clock, which again is on my GitHub repo, uses that same technique to have a background timer. So if I click run, then it'll start running down. So the main show dialog thread is just servicing Windows messages, but I've got a background thread that actually updates the display. And the clock I use for a lot of things, mainly making notes of when something happens so I can tie it. So for instance, that's when I was diagnosing a Citrix problem earlier, so that I can then go and look at event logs and process starts and stops and so on. Oh, again, with PowerShell, of course. Again, they're on my GitHub repo with 100+ scripts in there now. Okay, well, that's enough of me sort of making this up as I go along, which seems to be the story of my life. Any specific questions about that? Anybody still there? Anybody awake? No? We've all died of boredom. Oh, well, sorry.
Well, Guy, that was enough to take. But yeah, pretty interesting. I mean, I see the way you approach with these programs, and PowerShell is really interesting. I mean, I think you're in love with this.
Oh, absolutely. I'm lucky that my day job is mostly writing PowerShell, not this sort of stuff. This is a community script that I have to do evenings and weekends. But yeah, my day job is writing PowerShell mostly for software vendors.